but as a general principle, you know, the feeling about city walls and with landmarks, and I agree. Sorry. Begin the beginning.
I have a slight cold. I hope that doesn't do it.
Say this is your life. Maybe you want to talk about the painter. Shall we begin? Are you all ready? Are you ready? I'm just going to do one thing, excuse me, but you have, I think, a blonde hair right there. Now you know. But let's keep it our secret.
It's thread.
Welcome to New York's, excuse me, I'm going to start again. Disconcerted me wherever it was. Welcome to Inside New York's Art World. I'm Barbara Lee Diamonstein, and our guest tonight, Richard Haas, is best known for work of very grand scale, special vision, and I guess a very painterly tradition. Richard Haas has created what many consider to be the best of city walls, a judgment that I would agree with. Very warm welcome to you.
Thank you.
In fact, it's been said that you paint buildings on buildings with a definite sense of mission. What does that mean?
Well, they've said a lot of things. The titles always interest me, actually. One was, the first title I heard was The Grand Illusion, and then it went on into other less delightful ones. I guess the mission aspect is really what started me feeling the lack of something, you know, and from that the need to really embellish the city, to see the kind of wanton destruction constantly, I think abhors us all, and it's a means. I think one time I used the term bandaging up wounded areas, which makes some sense to me, and the whole idea is really about piecing back together a kind of jigsaw puzzle which has missing parts, you know, trying to find the whole.
You've said that you see every blank wall as a wound to the environment, one that obviously you intend to doctor up. That is obviously, too, from an architectural tradition of an earlier era. Perhaps we should begin in terms of your own background. It is not accidental, I guess, your interest in architecture as well as art. You were born in Spring Green, Wisconsin, the home of Frank Lloyd Wright and Taliesin III.
Mm-hmm.
Was
1, 2, and 3.
Was his presence a major influence on you?
Yes. You couldn't avoid him. The town had 865 people, and his fellowship sort of hovered over it on a hillside. So it was a very strong influence, I think, from as far back as I can remember. Then it kind of came back to me when I was in high school. I had already left the town when I was about 11, but all of my relatives still lived there, including my great uncle, who was his stonemason and worked for him for about 25 years as a sort of master stonemason, and Mr. Wright was always very interested in the craftspeople being around. And he my uncle invited me out for 2 summers to work with him, learning the craft. But mostly I didn't learn the craft. I learned how to avoid work as much as possible and sort of sneak through the more interesting areas of Taliesin, where I would watch them doing the drawings, finding the library very interesting there, and I spent about 2/3 of my time, I think, foraging through whatever materials were available.
After seeing at firsthand what architects do, did you ever consider being one yourself?
Well, I had this great idea of being an architect, I think, at that time, and somehow, partly being there and partly just really feeling more and more what an architect does versus what I like to do, and those two things being two very different things, I gravitated very strongly toward art. I mean, I wanted to make pictures, and they had to do a lot of stuff with rulers and straight edges and so on, And it was becoming more and more antithetical to really what I was after. So I think very shortly after that, my whole interest in being an architect sort of dropped completely, whereas before that it was kind of building up to something,
And you turned to art. And not only did you turn to art, you turned to New York City, where you came, I guess, in the early 1960s, when the art, I guess, was best characterized by various movements such as minimalists, pop artists, conceptual artists, some, I guess,
still is. I mean,
abstract expressionists. How did your own art fit into that environment?
Well, I didn't quite get here that quickly. I spent 3 years in Minneapolis, 4 years in Michigan, with 2 summers in New York in between, and then finally moved here in '67. And so I really came aware, I guess, of New York from that period on. Before that, and up through that period, I was involved in the going movements. I don't know. Other artists talk about this, but I tried everything.
What did your early work look like?
What year?
Well, by the time you arrived in New York, I think you always thought of yourself as a closet realist. But what did that work look like?
Right. Well, all right, there's 2 avenues. On one side, I was trying to be de Kooning one year. I was studying with Jack Tworkoff and trying to be de Kooning. Shortly afterwards, I was very involved in one of your previous people, Jimmy Rosenquist, because he was from Minnesota, and we sort of had contact with each other in the early '60s, and I was doing some very large collage work, a la that period, into color shape canvases shortly after that.
Were you equally influenced by commercial art and advertising as he?
Strangely enough, I think we both found...
the scale of the work?
Well, we both found the same place. Across the river from the University of Minnesota was the Outdoor Advertising Company, which after that became the art school. And I used to go over there to get big, collage pieces like tomato reds and so on and so forth. And he actually started sign painting, I think, at that same institution about 2 years earlier. So that particular place, I think, had an influence on both of us, strangely enough.
Certainly in terms of scale. How did you first become involved in urban subject matter and work at the scale that you did?
Well, I think after coming to New York and living in the area I do, which is what was become known now as the Soho area, I began refocusing on the architecture, the buildings. Also, I was making these little boxes, these little dioramic boxes of my streets.
Was that your Cornell period?
Well, that's what somebody characterized it. I don't think it really was Cornell at all. I started with Vermeer. I wanted to recreate Vermeer's rooms. And I got many obscure books in libraries where I found diagrams of his house, and I was trying to reconstruct Vermeer's interiors, And that led to other things, and I started to really kind of do interiors that had ambience. I was doing, for instance, Gertrude Stein in her dining room, Apollinaire in his bedroom, Matisse in Nice. I know they went on like this. There were about 25 different boxes of that nature. Some were architects, Gaudi and the Park Wheel. And then I started to do the streets of the immediate environment that I was living in, the streets of Broome Street, Green Street, the subway stop at Lafayette and Houston, my meat market, Porcelli Brothers, Finelli's Bar, etc., etc. And these became, very complicated three-dimensional interiors in perspective that when you looked in, the light, etc., etc., everything kind of tried to lock into place. And at that same time, I also started to do the facade prints of the buildings, such as the one that's behind me here. And this kind of work, I think, has continued and developed ever since. I'm still very much involved in it.
How would you describe your work currently?
Complicated, diversified, architectural, basically.
But it obviously comes out of a long and informed tradition, historically, painterly, art historically. To the work of whom do you most respond in that tradition?
Well, I collect Piranesi. I have maybe 15 or 20 of his prints now. I tried to collect Canaletto. Well, I have a hold on one of his prints. That's as far as I am with that. But those two artists, I think, are seminal. Charles Marion is another, 19th century French graphic artist. And I suppose the list continues. In the 20th century, Hopper and Sheeler are my most interesting Americans.
There are, too, a number of early Dutch painters who worked in a tradition that yours is reminiscent.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm very interested in the Dutch. Peter Sanrodam is probably the artist of the Dutch period that I'm most interested in. Yes. He would do these, I'm sure you would recognize him, if not by name, but by the white church interiors with the white pillars and then the kind of very simple black objects surrounding them. He was very influential on the 20th century through an artist named Mondrian, who I think got a lot from him. And I actually discovered him through my conversations with Saul LeWitt. So, I mean, there's many ways of looking at the Dutch artists, and I think they're absolutely essential for our period, for our time,
You've used a reference to your work, and that reference is architectural illusion. What does that mean? And how does it differ from architectural rendering?
Well, it certainly, I think, differs from that. I think it sometimes gets connected with trompe-l'oeil, which is a word I tend to avoid, though that's the word that I think gets attached to what I do more than any. The reason I like to use the word architectural illusion versus trompe-l'oeil is that it pinpoints a much broader and a different history of art. It begins really, I think, with the Greeks and Romans, and certainly Pompeii has a lot of evidence of architectural illusion as a major form in the work of that period. And then it follows all the way through, the Italians, the Renaissance, the whole attitude toward embellishment of interior and exterior space through painting and sometimes through relief sculpture. And it's separate from the kind of thing that we sometimes associate with trompe-l'oeil, which is, on an easel, the violin on the door, and the shadow, etc., which is a very sort of focused, specific kind of thing. Architectural illusion, I think, involves a much more encompassing, all spatial changing, or a spatial change that sort of grabs you, takes you in, and really takes you out.
Is it your intention to deceive?
That's a part of it, but I don't really like the idea of, in quotes, fooling the eye, and I don't think it really does. I mean, I think that's maybe one of its sort of initial or partial aspects, but the fact that it remains fake is very important too,
What are you really trying to show?
I think I'm trying to play one thing off against the other on say, the facade. I'm trying first of all to lock that pictorial, illusionistic pictorial painting onto a particular space in a particular place. And I'm trying to be very sensitive to the conjunction of those two things.
Well, why don't we select a particular place, and that is one of your best-known projects. Perhaps we should hold this up and you might describe it. In fact, in black and white, it's really doesn't do the justice that it deserves, and that is a major work in Boston at the Boston Architectural Center. And it might be of considerable interest for you to know that was a blank white wall. And Richard Haas decided to complete the environment. Can you tell us what you did there?
Well, the building happens to be an architectural school, appropriately enough. And there is an element here that you see. This is the air conditioning unit. That's not part of the painting. What I received initially was a photograph of this very wall blank by the president of the school now, Peter Blake, who's been a long, well-known name in the history of architecture, contemporary-wise. And he said, "Can you do anything with this?" And I sat around for, I think, about 3 months just staring at that. And then I started to kind of pick away at it with different thumbnail sketches. And what really got me involved, I think, is the notion of these two round ends and the sort of symmetry of the whole shape, and then the regular breakup of the space, which was part of the wall. And I saw it in some way related to the sort of late 18th century grand, brutal, ominous drawings of Ledoux or Boilly. And this started to all fall in place. I saw the possibility of the cross-section cutaway, which was something I've always liked and wanted to deal with. And so I sort of sliced the building. But I didn't slice the building and discover what was inside of there, which was mostly elevator shafts, et cetera, et cetera. I sort of sliced it and tried to invent an interior for it. And the interior got more and more grand, I think. And, ultimately, things happen that you never plan. For instance, when I did this thing, a lot of people said, "Well, how come you're doing the Christian Science church?" And I said, "What?" I said, "The Christian Science Church, it's right over here, and it's a domed building almost exactly like this, And in fact, I hadn't thought of that. But it does relate on a direct line, access to the Christian Science Church, and relates to it in a way that's very interesting. And when IMP, for instance, did that project, I think they did something where they did a cut into...
You mean the Hancock building?
No, the Christian Science...
Oh, it was his building, that's
yes.
quite right, yes.
So there is some sort of play between this particular building where it's sited and that building a few blocks away, and it gives people a nice reference that I didn't know about.
Don't you take that into consideration, the environment, the context in which the wall is located?
Well, I took certain things into consideration, but then other things happened that I never planned for. For instance, in the one down on Green Street, I never knew that it had a nightlife when I did it, And then more people have commented that they like it at night when the two lights are on in the windows and the street light glows and sort of gives it this strange moonlight kind of light and shadow effect. I never planned that. I mean, it just happens,
Perhaps you should describe the Green Street project.
Well, the Green Street is probably the one that people here in the city would be more familiar with, and that's in Soho. It's a cast iron building side where the side repeats the front facade, and there are two actual windows that I had to design the entire project around in order to fit those in.
But while you designed that, you also included animal life as well as, you may have excluded nightlife. You included, is it a cat on the windowsill?
Yes, I put in Hanford Yang's cat because he wanted it there. Well,
Perhaps you should tell us about the genesis of some of these projects. Obviously, they take a long time to execute. Obviously, too, particularly in New York City, where many of your projects are in historic districts, they require permissions, they require approvals of all sorts. How much of the subject matter is either restricted or dictated by the kinds of approvals that you must receive?
Well, I think the major restriction in the beginning is the client, whoever or whatever that might be, and then my real restriction is the actual object which I've been asked to or have chosen to deal with. So those are the primary ones. But I would say if I were to just relate the problems that I've had getting each project done, it would take up the rest of our time here.
Is it
This project,
a struggle?
oh, I don't know, it gets worse every time. This one was a year and a half, and we lost it 3 times in the process, you know, and then went back to square one and tried to piece it all back together again.
Do you think some of it relates to a prevailing attitude about city walls in general or public art?
Well, I just think that people have a different attitude towards something that's going to go in their space or in the public space, you know, and I think everyone's involvement becomes much more crucial. For instance, well, it reminds me of some of the things that were said at the last landmarks meeting when I was making that presentation. Why put a Doric colonnaded building next to a federal building when both were really being painted on a brick wall which was blank, for example?
Perhaps you should tell what project it is, because that one has not yet been executed and has only just been approved. Perhaps you would describe its location and what your inspiration or focus is.
Well, it's a Con Ed building built, I think, by Edward Barnes, if I'm not mistaken, which has a blank 100-foot long brick 44-foot high facade that then comes out about 20 feet, which is an ersatz fake federal staircase next to a rather ramshackle real federal building on the corner.
You might tell us the background to all of this.
And then behind it is the Brooklyn Bridge, which forms the backdrop for the building. That's the site, South Street Seaport area, sited right behind the Brooklyn Bridge. So my proposal was simply to repeat the 2 federal buildings on the left-hand side where there was a space identical to it. But in the center area, which went in 3 feet, to paint a Doric columned Greek Revival arcade that looked through and saw the Brooklyn Bridge. And so that it opens the building up completely, and you see through it and actually see what's behind the building. And it, in the last drawing, actually, is all 3 bridges are there now. So you can see a little essay on the bridges of that area.
How accurate architecturally do you feel it necessary to have your works?
Well, the closer I can get to that, the better. I mean, I think that's maybe what turns me on most in the project, is that I can really lock, as I say, lock the piece in. And if I can show another 2 examples here.
Would you please?
Of more recent proposals that I'm now trying to invade in Chicago with. This is on North Michigan Avenue. The building is nothing again but this blank facade. One of these buildings on Michigan Avenue that you pass in almost any street like this. But curiously enough, the front of it, the top of this building has a beautiful Palladian villa front. And then it has this crazy sort of zigguratted top. And then the whole thing is blank. 2 real windows again here. So what I'm trying to do is to create a hole through the building, you know, and the villa becomes a real villa arcade that arches over here, and there's this kind of interior space that cuts through the building that becomes kind of like one of these grand Piranesi-like cavernous cut-through interiors. And it relates, again, this junction thing, it relates to one of the proposals made for the Tribune building, which sits over here, you see, where there were like 200 or 300 different proposals, several of which were some of the most phantasmagoric proposals ever made, I think, in the 20th century. And one of them happens to be very much like this, so it's like giving Chicago something it didn't get, you know, along with the clothespin, of course.
Who actually paints this on the wall? How does it go from the drawing board to the mural scale?
Well, I usually use the sign painting companies. There are maybe 2 or 3 sign painting companies in every city of a large enough size, and we try to get a competing bid from each, and then either take the lowest bid, or if we, unfortunately that's what we did in Boston, and that's why it took 1.5 years. The company went out of business and went bankrupt, and we had to sue them. Too low. Too low for
What kind of instructions do you give them? Is this all from a grid? I mean, what is the scale of your drawing to the wall?
1/2 inch to a foot to scale, you know, and they blow it up 24 times.
What are the maintenance considerations? You've done this wonderful wall in Soho, you've done this splendid wall in Boston. What happens, and for how long do you expect for this to last in the condition that it is when first you do it?
Well, the Soho one is already chipping, for instance, after 4 years, I think. The one here in Boston, I would assume will last much longer, if not 50 years, possibly. It'll fade away gradually because it's on a fine brick wall. We put down a special coat of preliminary glaze that's moisture resistant, and then did the painting over that. And the people that helped us, gave us the formula, said it should increase the lasting quality to at least 15 years. And my guess is that it would probably last longer.
How do you feel about the reality that sooner or later your work will vanish?
Well, we sort of live in a recycling kind of culture.
That's a good word.
So I don't know. I have mixed feelings about that. You know, some things I'll probably feel bad about them disappearing, and others I might just, you know, enjoy the disappearance. And then, of course, they could be repainted. You know, that's the third possibility.
You raise a point about the kind of world in which we live that is obviously portable, mobile. In some of your work for interior spaces, the work is designed for a specific space. Mm-hmm. Are most people willing to do that? To commission that kind of work?
Well, 2.5 have. I mean, since I was a client for myself, I can't count myself as a
You're the half.
I'm the half. 2 other people have decided to do it, yes. It's been very slow.
But I mean, kind of interior environment that you create. I think the one that you've created for yourself, obviously, doesn't have any outdoor space. So you've created it. Can you describe that?
Well, in my house, yes. I painted a balcony, I have one of these long, narrow kind of lofts, a space about exactly the size of this one we're in. No, it's narrower, about 8 feet narrower. So, you know, there's always this claustrophobia about the sidewalls. And in the living area, on one wall, I sort of painted 2 column balconies, a 2-column balcony that goes out and has a sort of series of wooden beams on the top, you know, like the grape arbor without the grapes, maybe. But a very simple sort of chunk out into the space. But the view is exactly what you would see if you looked out that way, which is really a sweep of the northern part of Soho and then the Manhattan skyline behind it. So it's a fifth floor view from my loft through the brick wall of what you would see. And then on the opposite side is a doorway looking through 3 other successive doorways to a window which sees the World Trade Center. And the axis of that spot is exactly such that you see the World Trade out this way and the Empire State this way, through the two.
Well, your own work is so painterly and comes from such a long tradition. How do you feel about the rest of the mural art, the wall art that surrounds us? How would you evaluate that in general?
Going back to the Renaissance?
Well, why don't we start there?
Well, I think there were some fine people around doing some very nice things then. You mean more recently, like in the last 10 years? I've objected to about 98% of it, I guess.
On what basis?
I don't think that most of it worked. It didn't fit, didn't lock in to the city space that it was trying to deal with. A few occasionally do work, I think. I'd have to almost go to each one and try to make some kind of an evaluation. But on the whole, I would say most of it doesn't. And then there's that third kind of thing, the social art that you see everywhere. And I think that is just a whole other category. I don't think it has anything to do with what I'm involved in at all.
Not at all. In fact,
No.
we're not even introducing the wall as sociology or neighborhood unification as an expression of art. But we're talking in general about certainly a phenomenon of the last decade, wall murals.
Well, it started as super graphics, didn't it? I mean, it was there was a sort of zany, zappy, post-pop, post-minimalist, post-color field painting, hard edge American movement that slowly got transplanted to the wall. It's a part of, I think, a whole fabric of, what went on in the lobby was like that too, right? You throw some plastic stripes and you run them right out the door. And it's all a part of this kind of thing that I think I have a abhorrent objection to. It reminds me of the plaza art, And I call the sculptures on the plazas brooches on the plazas, like stick a little thing after you're all done right there. And that's what most of it, I think, is. Sure doesn't have much to do with Bernini, does it?
I think a question that more and more people are beginning to focus on, not only in the world of art, but concerned citizens, public officials, is the whole question of public art that is obviously becoming more and more central to the concerns of anyone who creates or shows art or cares about art. Have you considered the implications of public art, particularly in a country that has, in a tradition that has always thought of art as a private and idiosyncratic an eccentric expression? In fact, the more idiosyncratic, in a sense, the more to be treasured, and suddenly making it a public concern.
Well, I think we've gone both ways with this over the centuries. Witness City Hall as one example of a public. I think it's maybe the finest building ever built in Western Hemisphere. I don't know.
New York City.
New York City Hall. And then, there was in certain periods, I think, a terrific interest in grand design city space in this country. The Burnham sort of thing, or the McKim-Mead-White sort of thing, But I think it certainly waxed and waned in the last 10 or 15 years, if not the last 30 or 40 years. And I think what we're really facing now is an attempt, and I would say it's not a noble attempt. It's a rather curious attempt. It's a kind of a back backdoor entry into the idea of trying to deal once more with public spaces. And I think artists have introduced the issue as much as anyone in this situation, more so than architects, really. You know, but it came in a way more as irony than as anything else. But then maybe that's all we can come in with, right?
Irony figures rather heavily in your work.
Yeah, I think that is definitely an aspect of it, you know.
Has anyone ever tried to censor or mute the subject matter?
Oh, yeah, all the time. Yeah. Well, not as, I don't think I've probably had to suffer that censorship as much as certain other artists. Maybe because they understand the obviousness of what I'm doing in some ways, you know, the obviousness of doing an architectural thing on an architectural backdrop. So, but I've had, you know, curious sort of things where they say, well, why do this there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, my aunt thinks, or my wife, we, the corporation, would like, you know, et cetera. I, for instance, did a Cadoro facade in an atrium space for Hyatt Regency Hotel in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The space is like 14 stories high. There was a blank box sticking out. When I get the calls from architects, so far at least, it's usually a distress call. Can you help us? We designed a box that we forgot about. We don't know what to do with this box. It's hanging up there, and it's looking very strange. And
Or this decade's answer to Ivy?
Well, either that or a mirror, I guess. But the first thing he said, well, we wanted to put a Helen Frankenthaler weaving, but we couldn't find one big enough. and it would, you know, match the Adolf Gottlieb on the other side. This is a very sophisticated hotel, I might add. So I started to sort of deal with it, you know, and I went through do something to it, do something else to it. Oh, that's somebody else's line. Well, I went into this thing where I tried, you know, various things. We went from Palladio through Sir Christopher Wren, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We tried
all those itty-bitty balconies in the interior of
yeah,
the space?
it's loaded with balconies all the way around, and that was the given. It was a very open situation. There wasn't much I could read off of the interior, you know. I'm stuck with the color and the shape, basically. But somehow, the more and more the Cadoro came back. Now, I originally wanted to do Sir John, a sort of relationship to Sir John Soane's atrium in his house in London, which I don't know if some of you are familiar with, was a grand space filled with antiquities, just stuck everywhere that you could see, you know, just pile it in there and fill up this atrium and make it claustrophobic. And I liked the idea of making this big space claustrophobic.
Which was antithetical to their original design.
No, the architect said he wanted to make it comfortable and homey, like Boston should be. So he didn't succeed, I felt. And what I wanted to do is help him with sticking, you know, on all of these balconies. I wanted to stick plaster casts of, you know, various orders of architecture moving up. I wanted to take what he called the promenade, which was this funny little thing sticking up in the middle of the lobby, where you were supposed to stand, no, the promontory, stand and gape, you know.
Look at the elevator.
Yeah, I wanted to turn it into a pulpit and stick like Pisano's, you know, sort of things around it, and the balconies would become, you know, sort of like neo-Baroque, and just really clutter that space up. And then, strangely enough, just down the street from that was, you know, Isabel Stewart Gardner's thing, where she brought a little bit of Venice. Oh, yeah. So what we ended up anyway with was the Venetian facade locking into that space, reading off of the balconies that exist, and then moving into a Venetian facade. But that one went on for, I mean, discussion after discussion with Prudential Life Insurance Company and the Hyatt chain, you know, two very respectable organizations, where it got down to, well, should we put the cat in or take it out? Should there be a parrot here? You know, that sort of thing became like the issue. My wife, we don't know what this is. I mean, you know, why don't you do a fountain? You know, all of that.
You didn't face any of those problems in the Strand at Galveston, because it was quite obvious, I guess, for you what you had to do there. Could you describe for us, firstly, what the Strand is and what you did to embellish and enrich it?
Well, that was a very simple problem, really. It was a building that had been covered over on a street that was basically Victorian. It was a Victorian street that had lost its top in the hurricane of 1900, so everything was truncated Victorian. And then they had put a 1940 plaster wall over two Victorian buildings to make it into one neo-1940s building next to two truncated Victorian buildings on a truncated Victorian block. So I simply tried to make back a truncated Victorian facade related to the architect of that town, who was a sort of Nicholas J. Clayton, one of my heroes, you know, sort of, and I took Clayton elements off of all of the buildings I could find of his and stuck them as a sort of homage to Nicholas J. Clayton, their local architect.
Well, as an homage to you, the AIA, in a certainly unusual gesture, this year will present you with its gold medal for outstanding...
I don't think it's gold.
Well, you can always change that. Well, they are presenting you with a medal nonetheless. If that's right, Philip Johnson gets the gold medal, and you receive the medal for outstanding art and craftsmanship. That's certainly an unusual gesture on their part. Is it for any specific project that you will be awarded that?
No, I think it was just the portfolio that, you know, was submitted of various ones. I think they were actually rather generous this year. I mean, they gave Robert Venturi an award for outstanding writing, and I don't remember who some of the others were, but a rather fine illustrator of architectural books was given an award. So maybe they're catching up with, you know, something. I don't know. It was nice.
In an interesting way, your work has become a kind of people's art. In some ways, it is a rival for galleries and for museums. Obviously, you are doing away with many man-made barriers. You are removing them, and it is the viewer and the object or the painting. Have you ever considered the implications of that?
That's one I'm not too sure how to deal with yet, because I think I, you know, grew up in the structure called the artist gallery structure, and it's very hard to sort of cross roles, you know, and move into this other world, which is a pretty difficult one to deal with. I mean, I suddenly find myself rather inept at doing things that I should be very good at.
For example?
You know, the PR world, or whatever you would call it, the whole thing where I have to do an awful lot of representing of myself and my ideas in some sort of public way. I mean, with, say, the city fathers of San Francisco or whoever it might be. If I have something I want to get done there, I really have to go through that whole route, and it's not a thing that, you know, artists, I think, are used to doing.
Well,
feel very comfortable with.
To Christo, because that is as much a part of his work, the sociology of it, as it's the ultimate expression of it.
He should give a seminar, or his wife.
Actually, they were both here, and they did. If the world is your canvas, and it is, are there any projects that you have in mind that are still in their developmental stage that we should know about?
Well, yeah, lots of them.
Should we start with Munich?
Well, let's start on 23rd and Lex, or 23rd and Park. That's the shadow I've always wanted to do.
First, tell us about your shadow projects,
Yeah.
if you would, and then the specific building.
Well, I started with the idea of the shadow about 4 years ago. I think it started as early as the first wall on Green Street. The very first one was the proposal to paint the shadows of the Empire State and the Chrysler on the facades of the World Trade Twin Towers, 1-to-1. And they would be done basically in off silver so that they would almost, but not quite, go away at high sunlight. That would be kind of a, I call it a memorializing measuring stick. And then after that, I became more interested in returning the shadow to the site of the building that was destroyed. So the shadow that I'm trying to deal with now would be on the corner of 23rd and Park Avenue, where the about 3 blocks from there stood the Madison Square Garden Tower of McKim, Mead & White. And this would be the shadow of that thing with the Diana by St. Gaudens at the top, done approximately in this. The building is big enough that it would be like a 1-to-1 shadow of that particular project, and it's a kind of building that, you know, we really got to get back somehow, right? So that's a way of bringing it back.
There are several ways that you try to enhance our environment in New York. Not very long ago, you were appointed a member, the artist member, of the New York City Art Commission. What are your responsibilities there?
Mostly to meet once a month and look at the work that's submitted. And
how does that whole process work? For most of the rest of us, it seems remote and sometimes mysterious. What does the Art Commission do? How does an artist submit his or her work to that commission? Who approves and on what basis? Can you tell us something about that?
As a member of the commission, I can say that it's a mystery to me as well.
As a member of the commission, perhaps you could do something about it. Why don't you start by telling us how it works?
Well, the works that we're basically an approval-disapproval agency. We don't, we don't go out and find.
Well, you are
work.
reactive rather than initiative, but
Yes.
you're an artist, and there are a number that are here with us tonight.
Well,
How would one go about submitting work to this city, and in what place and under what circumstances and for what purpose? Why don't you give us some of the ground rules? Tell us how to do it.
I would say call up to the Department of Cultural Affairs for one, if you can, find the proper person there. What unfortunately is happening is that the city is not buying anyone's art, and hasn't as long as I've been on the commission. There are a few remaining projects, that is, projects that are that were initiated before the, so-called the crunch of, so was it 74 or 75, I think. And so there were some murals to be completed. There were some paintings that were bought to be installed in various hospitals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there hasn't been a single project that has been, initiated since I've been on this commission, which is about a year and 3/4 now. And that's the sad state of affairs.
Is that
there.
because there isn't money available?
That's obviously what it is.
Does one ever choose to donate a work of art?
Yes, there's been not a lot, but a certain amount of that. And that's one of the things we'll then deal with, whether or not we should accept it.
Deal either with those works that are commissioned or those that are in public buildings?
Anything that goes into a public building is to be reviewed by the Art Commission for approval or disapproval.
In addition to public building, is it work that goes on public land, if not building?
That gets a little, I think, more problematic. Then it has a thing, for instance, if it's in the Central Park, it has to be there for 6 months or more before we look at it. In other words, it has to be a permanent piece. Many of the pieces are only there temporary. If it's in the MTA, like the subways, we don't look at it. If it's under some other agency, but yes, it would be any building or any thing that goes on a city site.
Our neighbors to the north, far north, I'm thinking of Canada, obviously have different art problems than we do, including the work of how does an artist in the provinces ever get to show his work either to major cities, to other artists, to museums, to dealers, to galleries. One of the ways they have invented, and I think a fine one, with all of its limitations, to deal with that, is an art bank, where the government actually buys works of art from artists, and those works of art are then rented to public buildings. And there is a rather rigorous procedure of panel review, other artists, museums, non-interference with galleries, and they have a procedure that they have developed over an extensive period of time. What do you think of the possibility of a country that is becoming as culturally mature or sophisticated as ours in developing an art bank?
Well, I suppose who's going to be the banker is the big question there. You know?
Well, in the end, obviously, someone has to choose.
Mm-hmm.
And in the end, when someone chooses, someone obviously disagrees. But with all of those limitations, is it an idea that has merit to you?
I think it would be amongst several ideas that would probably be good. I mean, I don't know. I know we did it when I was like teaching in a university. They had a university art bank as such. And
what school did that?
It was in Michigan and Michigan State, both. And they would get works from the artists on the campus, and then they would be distributed to various buildings under that kind of a process.
Did they buy them or get them?
Yes, that's why I'm always dubious about things like that. Yes, if they bought them, as I do in Canada, and help subsidize and support the arts that way. I think CAPS does a good job, by the way. I put a plug in for them because, you know, they are very, very strong about taking and getting works from the artists that they give grants to as part of their grant and placing those works in institutions in the state. And I've gotten, for instance, letters back from...
Would you describe for those of us who are not familiar with that acronym what CAPS stands for and what it does?
Well, CAPS is the, I don't know the exact name, the title.
Creative Artists...
Creative Artists Public Service, yeah.
In any event, it is the individual artist, both visual, literary, photographers, etc., arm of the New York State Council on the Arts. It does not give grants to the individual, but the CAPS subdivision does.
Yes, I think there was some law where you couldn't give grants from the council, the state of New York Council couldn't give grants, so they set up a sub-agency
business to give a grant to an individual, not quite so safe as to an institution.
And I hear it's in trouble again. I mean, there's somebody that wants to, well, there's always somebody that wants to disband everything, but they want to disband it and take that away.
As a brief aside, if I may correct that, I think its trouble is, I hope, less than that and less permanent. From the early days of passing any kind of legislation in this country for the arts, the congressional debate centered on what was then called the Free Piano Lesson Bill. The fears that legislators would have about funding to the arts. From time to time, that crops up again in a rather surprising way. A photographer who went through the usual panel review system, and a rigorous one at that, peer group photographers, each of whom have some distinction and whose work has quality, decided to award a $5,000 grant to a photographer. That photographer chose to do what he called a photo essay, a sociological photo essay, and it was about, I can't recall the title, about women and their bodies and how they use them. A legislator who coincidentally was the chairman of the legislature's finance committee felt that public funds were going for pornography. So now there is quite an exhaustive review of that grant.
But I would think they would do very well in the art bank.
Unfortunately, I thought it was both pornography and a bestseller, and I'm afraid it's neither one of the two.
Well,
you said there were ideas other than the art bank that might be appropriate to support the arts and the individual artist. Did you have anything specific in mind?
Well, I haven't been focusing on it, too much of late. I know when I was asked once to, make some suggestions to the possible ways that the city of New York, for instance, could help the artists more. I think one of the most critical problems, for instance, for artists, especially the younger artists today, is this problem of space, maybe it's everyone's problem in New York, but it's become more critical than it was even 10 years ago when I came into the city. There's simply, space is outrageous, and the artists are having a terrible time trying to find some place, to live. And there can be ways in which I think, through some of the self-help programs, etc., that
sweat equity program.
Yeah, that artists can be included as part of this, where they can get a space where they won't be further ripped off as they are in Soho. The history of Soho is this ongoing history of how to follow and exploit the artist.
Actually, it's not a problem, if I may, restricted to Soho. I think it's a term, what has occurred there is a term that was first coined in England, and it's sometimes referred to as gentrification, where areas that were of such limited interest to the city or commercial developers were possible for the less economically privileged to live in, often the creative community, who would come in, give special color and style to an area, and then, of course, upgrade the level of that area. So that gentrification is generally good for the cities and bad for the existing tenants, and that is also, not restricted to the artists.
No, that's
true. The existing poor that were there actually before the artists. Do you have any other suggestions?
For programs?
Improving the lot of the artists?
Well, I'm for the subsidy of the artist, the individual artist. I really am. I was, for instance, rather concerned about, I think, a turn that's beginning to happen in the federal grant-giving programs, where there seems to be, they're under, I think, a heavy attack from right now about the distribution of monies to serious artists. There seems to be a constant desire to spread it thinner on the edges, and I think the idea, don't give it to what might be the best possible project, but give it to a local group that might do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, Well,
you're touching on, of course, the central problem debated currently, and that is the issue of what is now referred to as populism versus elitism.
Yes.
And there's that whole other school that says what we are faced with now is access and access to the best. But it certainly is something that must be resolved. You talked about focus before. Where is your work heading? What are you focusing on now? You have one picture that you brought with.
Well, yes, that's a sort of a continuation of the Chicago project. That's a fish cold storage warehouse on the Chicago River, which the Chicago River, of course, we know is the world's longest sewer. And it has this kind of waterfall effect of rustication at the bottom, opening up to a kind of grand arcade, and then certain windows exist, certain elements up here do exist, and it simply completes it as an object entity. And it faces the downtown, and it has a scale that can sort of hold its own in Chicago's scale, which is the Merchandise Mart and the Sears Tower, etc., around it. So I think in the outdoor work, these two projects maybe, as well as the completed one in Boston, and I suppose that's why I chose these three, say more about where my interests are at the moment. I think I'm trying to take it further and further into the possibilities for fantasy, because really, if you can paint it, if you don't have to build it and you can paint it, then it should do it should do something.
That's your own conservation ethic?
Well, that's the other thing, is that I can't alter the real estate without actually altering it, can I? And I would like, in other words, to exploit that medium to the hilt.
You say you want to take it further and further into the realms of fantasy. Can you give us an example of what you have in mind?
Well, those are two. You see, I usually, for instance, I have this other idea of a space, of a blank wall, a large building, such as I find almost everywhere, where it actually begins to break up and competing facades take that space and make it move in, you see, so that in the right shape, in the right space, this one building sort of dissolves and becomes a kind of cul-de-sac. It's hard to describe these things without illustrations. That's why it's good to have them.
Let's take our conversation one step further into the realm of fantasy. If you had your druthers, what would you paint and where would it be?
If I had my druthers, what would I paint and where would it be? I was very interested in the subways recently, and especially in the 53rd Street station, underneath the Museum of Modern Art, you have this magnificent drum-like arcade, and I thought of that in relation to the kind of cavernous subterranean interiors that I'm so interested in say, the prints I collect, say, by Piranesi and so on, and I thought, why couldn't we do something a little more interesting down there, In other words, that might be a place to go to put something. And I suppose ultimately I might think of actually building some things, not architecture so much, but things that are more dimensional rather than just painted, you see. And I've been doing a lot with decorative elements that are, I silkscreen, for instance, for the show in Chicago, Louis Sullivan decorative elements that come off on contact paper. And then, I go into the gallery with these long sheets of contacted Louis Sullivan decorative friezes, and we do a Louis Sullivan interior in the gallery.
Richard Haas, who for so long has demonstrated the role of the artist in the urban space, has given us further evidence tonight with this dialogue. Thank you very much for being with us, and thank you, audience, too.
Is that an hour?
Really? An hour and something. And what we do now is ask the class to join in the conversation. Instantly, that contact paper thing is just would fit, that other show perfectly. Because in addition to the poster, I would like